read it to you later, but I want you to keep that in mind during the sermon today. And Pastor, when he starts off here and he says, rejoicing in Yahweh, this is where our joy needs to come from. This is where we find our joy. Pastor gave a series of sermons where he spoke about finding your joy in Yahweh, finding your joy in the work of Yahweh. And this is where our joy comes from. This is where rejoicing comes from. It only comes from Yahweh. You don't find these things in entertainment. You don't find it in the foolishness of the world. You don't find it in seeking your own pleasures or desires. Those things are pleasures that only last momentarily, like the pleasures of Egypt that their forefathers spoke of that last momentarily. But true joy, true rejoicing you find from Father Yahweh by keeping His laws, being taught by the great house of Yahweh, and by Yahweh's appointed servant. And the world, as Pastor says here, he was talking about this article. We won't be able to read much of this article, but how they were talking yesterday, this is when he gave the sermon on 12:18, but since that time period, we've seen the increase of the speech and the talking of the wars and the coming wars, the coming destruction, and nuclear war as being as we will read in this article, a certain part where it's not if, but when. And that's the time period we're in right now, where nuclear war, it's not, is there going to be nuclear war? If there was nuclear war. No, it's when these things do take place. And even those in the governments and in society today, the inhabitants of the earth, even they're starting to recognize and see that this nuclear war is coming. They, of course, don't understand the prophecies. They don't understand these things were prophesied. Only you, the great house of Yahweh, have been taught these things by Yahweh's servant Israel. But they're starting to see that these wars are coming and it's inevitable. And how what used to be called the unthinkable of taking place, the unthinkable of, a modern-day society crumbling, how these things will come to pass. And Pastor picks up here on page 251 in verse 6. He says, the bombs, the government, they're getting ready for war. And of course, we knew it. We knew what they were bringing. We kept preparing. They quit preparing. We kept preparing for these days and for what's going to take place. We should never stop preparing, being prepared. Most importantly in our minds, having ourselves right with Father Yahweh, making sure that we are being righteous, as Pastor said last Sabbath. Righteousness is overcoming, that we're striving and overcoming our carnal minds, overcoming the fleshly desires, the unlawful lusts, and becoming like Father Yahweh. But also physical preparations, physical preparations of not being lackadaisical and thinking that stuff you put away 10, 15, 2 years ago, those things are going to be just all great and dandy. You got to keep preparing. You can't just buy a bunch of stuff, put it away, and you're ready. Well, stuff goes bad if you haven't noticed. If you let things sit around for too long, it rots. It attracts rodents and things, and these things go bad. So you gotta keep up on your preparing. It's kind of like we do weekly preparation for the Sabbath, right? We wash, we ablute. We prepare for the Sabbath. We come and confess our sins. We prepare ourselves to stand before Father Yahweh on the Sabbath day. We should be continuing to keep our physical preparations, in the forefront of our minds and not getting caught up in the day-to-day grind. It's very easy to do, and you got to set your mind in advance to not do so. Pastor says we kept preparing for these days and for what's going to take place. One thing we're seeing, and this is what you have to keep in mind, is the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes have come down to us today, as Yahweh showed they would in Genesis 49. Now they have taken over the nations. They've become a multitude of nations. Okay? Only, as it says in Moshe, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. These 12 tribes, the sons of Jacob, are the ones that went forth and inhabited the earth. Skipping down here to verse 8, Pastor says, now from that in this time period, the nuclear time period, Yahweh also has a righteous work going on, and you're sitting in it at this time. Praise Yahweh. It was prophesied to be established along with this time period. I read the dates to you last week, and I have the articles here, And we're sitting in the only established work of Yahweh on the face of the earth, man. Out of billions of individuals spread throughout the earth, you're a select few that Yahweh has called out of this deception that Satan has the world under at this time to sit into the only established work of Yahweh on the face of the earth. The one that's going to usher in and bring back all the other works. Resurrect the dead and bring them back to life. It's such a privilege and an honor if we really stop and consider and to think and focus on these things. The opportunity that Yahweh has afforded us in these last days of many, many people. It's quite astonishing at times, and Yahweh willing, we'll always keep that astonishment in the forefront of our minds and never take for granted the great blessing and the gift that we have to be in the great house of Yahweh in these last days. And Pastor, we're going to skip forward here to verse 14 and 15, and we're just going to be reading here in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 12, because this shows the cause of what we see in the world today. And Yeshua the Savior said in Matthew 24 verse 12, and because iniquity, Pastor says iniquity means doing away with the laws, not practicing the peaceful solution character education program that actually brings success. You hear people, they look at the peaceful solution character education program as being some kind of, that's for the kids, or that's for people who, eat too much, or, they don't know how to talk to people. No, the peaceful solution character education program are these laws of Yahweh that must be practiced, must be kept. If you reject them, you practice iniquity. These are the only things that bring success. It brings everything a person wants in life. That's what it does if you use it. See that key word there? Use. If you use it, right? You have to use the peaceful solution character education program for it to work in your life. Pastor says if you don't use it, you'll go the way of Cain, of course. And that worked out real well for Cain, right? Vengeance, war, and retaliation, never finding peace, never being at ease. Surely, man, we can remember the history that's written in the sacred scriptures and see what comes from wars and fighting. What comes from not humbling ourselves, not allowing ourselves to be respectful, forgiving, and steadfast in righteousness. In verse 15, continuing in Matthew 24 and verse 12, and because iniquity, and the iniquity comes from what we see in Matthew 24 verse 11, these false prophets, these many false prophets who teach iniquity. They teach, the laws, you don't have to do that. Jesus did all that for you. No, there's something better, You just do whatever, and if we don't have what's right for you, you go down the block to the next corner and go to that church and do whatever they say. No, these false prophets have brought about the iniquity that we see in Matthew 24 verse 12. And because iniquity, the rejecting of Yahweh's laws, will abound, will take a leap in these last days, the love of the many will grow cold. I mentioned that, and it leads to verse 29 and of the nuclear bombs that are going to be used here. Iniquity taking a leap in the last days. Not just increasing steadily, but actually leaping. And what have we seen? Even in our lifetime. In our short existence here on earth. If you think about the age of mankind. We're a mere youth in the age of mankind. Mere youth in the age of our great high priest Yeshua. Right, he's got 2,000 years ahead of us. But in just our lifetimes, in just a few decades, we have seen a leap of iniquity increasing in these last days. Fulfilled prophecy, Yahweh's prophecy fulfilled right before our very eyes. If you have an open mind and you're looking for the right things, you'll see it. You'll see it every day when you read the news, every day when you witness what's taking place as Yahweh's laws are rejected amongst the world and mankind continues in iniquity. And we see a leap in these last days of the rejecting of Yahweh's laws and the love of many growing cold. There is no love amongst mankind. Now, Pastor goes and he reads this article, which is, written by people who aren't called by Yahweh. They're not a part of Yahweh's house. They're probably not eating clean foods. not living clean lifestyles, but even they see the imminent danger that mankind is in because of the love growing cold and hatred going forth throughout the world. Pastor says in verse 16, it shows the anger. Here's the frustration that's going on in the governments today. It says, United States rethinks strategy for the unthinkable. It's supposed to be unthinkable. What? America falling, the Western powers, NATO falling, the Vatican falling. No, those things are, no, that's, come on now. That was the Apostle Yochanan. He must have been smoking something when he wrote those prophecies in Revelation. This is what mankind, they really don't stop and consider the accuracy of the scriptures, because of course they're caught up in the entertainment, and the lifestyles that Satan's put in front of them, the lust for oil and this wine, this entertainment and their lifestyles, searching after money and silver and gold and trying to acquire wealth. But this article says the United States rethinks strategy for the unthinkable. Suppose the unthinkable happened and terrorists struck New York or another big city with an atom bomb. Or, Pastor says, suppose they struck Abilene with a bomb, which the Air Force Base would be a place to hit, to stop the armies, to stop the military. So think of that. What should people do? In this article, we're going to have to skip through this article, but this article, if you go back and read this in its entirety, it shows the intensity of the hatred amongst the nations, and just as Pastor brought out for many, many years, and even used the works of like Caspar Weinberger in the book The Next War, showed how nuclear war can break out in a matter of hours. How these tensions and the hostility that we see on all these different regions, of course, all just, I guess, miraculously in and around the Great River Euphrates, in that fourth part of the earth, but in these regions of, North Korea and China, Taiwan, China, the Philippines, Russia, and the European countries, and NATO and the NATO allies, Iran, Syria, all these nations just brewing for many, many years, just brewing. And you can see Yahweh allowing these things to be held back to allow us to continue to overcome, to be able to qualify. But as Pastor said last week, man, we really have to pick up the pace, and intensify and overcoming. I think Pastor, he gave himself 3 weeks when he gave that sermon on 8/6/2011. He said by the time, that his next birth date, that he was going to overcome those things. He gave himself 3 weeks. I remember another sermon where he said, overcome it tonight. Get it done now. Put an end to sin now. Don't wait and don't delay. You don't want to run out of time. And in verse 22 here, just right in the middle here, it says, and this is talking about with North Korea and the instability between North and South Korea and the Western powers. And it says, due to Seoul's reckless maneuvers of confrontation and war, a war on the peninsula is not a matter of if, but when, it added. Okay? War is not, it's not if war breaks out, it's when war breaks out. Even these generals and these admirals and these leaders in the military institutions, they see that it's when these wars break out. And it's not going to be a conventional war of people chasing each other and shooting at each other. These are going to be nuclear wars. They're going to be nuclear weapons, but it's tactical, right? You heard Lukashenko last week in the news, right? He said, the news reporter was asking him, about why are you taking these Russian nukes? He said, don't forget, they're tactical. Tactical nukes. Come on, it's just a little small nuke. Surely it can't be that bad. Mankind, you can see the confusion abounding in their minds. We're just going to use a small nuke. We're going to be able to control, how far it goes. And Pastor said they'll actually deceive themselves into thinking they can control these wars, and they're going to lose control of it. It's going to get out of hand. In verse 27 on page 253, Pastor says, now the history of the nuclear weapons, it started, now remember Yeshua's words here, remember all the prophecies of the house of Yahweh established. In the last days, I will establish my house. This house, man, that we sit in was established by Father Yahweh. It was no coincidence, mere coincidence, or just happenstance, or just occurred that Yisrayl and his brother Jacob established Yahweh's house. This was done, guided, inspired, and directed by Father Yahweh. In the last days, I will establish my house. In Genesis 49, in the last days, this is going to be done by the 12 tribes who have become a multitude of nations. Then he shows the genes there in Genesis 49. And what he shows there in Genesis 49, and each one of those tribes can be seen among the multitude of nations now in preparing for this war, as we just read in thinking the unthinkable. But notice he says in Matthew 24:14 that along with this darkening of the sun, the increase in iniquity, the increase in false prophets in verse 11, increase in iniquity in verse 12. And then he says, this message of mine, Yeshua is speaking here, this message is going to be preached in all the world. Well, of course, the prophecies say the same thing. Isaiah 2:2 shows that it will be preached in all the world to all nations. Okay, and this was only accomplished, man, only in these last days. Only in the last couple of years has it been possible to actually put forward a message to all the nations, with the increase and the power of the internet and the spread of the internet and the fact that it's being pushed into every country. Yahweh using Satan's armies for his own benefit. Of course, Satan wants, the darkest parts of Africa to have smartphones and internet and free Wi-Fi and all those things because they want to influence their minds. Well, Yahweh's using that same increase of the spread of the internet to bring forth the message of the last day's witness, this message of warning of what is coming because of sin to the furthest parts of the earth. And then we've covered several other prophecies now that have been prophesied for this time period to be done by the house of Yahweh, and showing who is actually called or assigned to bring forth this message. Let them foretell. The two witnesses, not just any Tom, Dick, or Harry, as Pastor used to say. It just wasn't, hey, you look pretty decent, let's take you and use you to do this work. No, it was prophesied to be done by these two witnesses. Let them foretell them, the two witnesses Yeshua was speaking of, that work, knowing that he was going to be the high priest over that work in these last days. And remember, man, just because Yisrael sleeps doesn't mean his work has stopped. His work remains in each and every one of you and all those who have latched onto this message and are standing firm in his teachings. This is how this work continues to go forth and be spread to this entire earth. And we know what's next, the end. The message will be preached to all the world, and then the end. That's what's coming. War. These things aren't going to pass by. They're not going to wait for a different generation. It's going to be done in this generation. This last day's house of Yahweh, the great work of the two witnesses, of the great spokesman, Yisrael Abel Hawkins. Now, continuing on here, we're going to be jumping through verses 32 and 33, reading here in Matthew 24 and verse 33 and 34. And it reads, in the same way, when you see all these things, look at verse 34. Truly I say to you, and remember what it said in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 7. It talked about nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes, natural disasters, disease epidemics, pestilences, the things that we see coming to pass in these last days. These things building and getting worse. Where there's so many avenues of things just being right on the verge of the total unthinkable, as mankind considers it to be unthinkable. Not to have food on the shelves. To not have places to live or the ability to get water. In verse 34, truly I say to you, that generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. What a beautiful prophecy this is bringing forth, the work of Yahweh and the nuclear bombs, and the world is so scared of right now. And then he says, it's my house. He said in these last days, I will establish my house. Well, we know it's the house of Yahweh. It's always been called the house of Yahweh. This is this generation that will not pass away, this last days house of Yahweh. Pastor says, now I was born in 1934. In this article, History of the Nuclear Weapons, starting with scientific breakthrough of the 1930s. I was born in 1934. This article plainly says, starting with scientific breakthrough of the 1930s. Pastor was born in 1934. It's amazing to see how many things increased and abounded and flourished in the 30s, in 1930, and the short couple of years right around 1934. Starting with the scientific breakthrough of the 1930s, starting a generation that the Savior is speaking of here, a generation that won't pass away until you see all of it, including this message of the kingdom being preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end. The end will come. Praise Yahweh. How could it be any plainer? Where else could you go besides Yahweh's house? Where? Nowhere. Think of that. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to run and hide? You either have Yahweh's protection, or you'll be caught up, in this happenstance that's occurring to the world, and it's all going to happen to them, because they don't have Yahweh's protection, so they got things happening to them. Now, Pastor says here, skipping on down here to verse 38, he says, iniquity will abound in this generation. Will abound. How is it abounding? By television, radio, telephone, smartphone, internet, computer, all these technological advances, that, yes, make life have some different comforts, make certain things easier. If you want to talk to somebody, you don't have to wait till you see them. It could be months or years. You can call them on the phone or send them a message. But this is also how iniquity abounds, Just think of how quick you can do things with a phone or with a computer. Talk to people all the way across the earth, instantly, and think of how quick that sin is going forth that quick. The sin, the teachings of fornication, adultery, bestiality, and sodomy, the teachings of, the holidays and Sunday worship, the teachings against Yahweh's laws, these things abounding in this generation by this entertainment, the increase in the technological advances that has allowed entertainment to reach forward. You don't got to go to the circus. You don't got to go to the mall or the fair. You can sit right there at home in your lazy boy, pull it up with one hand, or one finger. It's coming from Hollywood or Follywood. I'm wondering how many lawsuits are coming at the Catholic Church, and how many will have to come before the people wake up and say, what in the world has gone on all these years? If the Catholic Church was not the religion that the mother of these harlots that's spreading these teachings, they would have gone under a whole long time ago, man. All the evil that they've done and the things they've been caught doing, but they just keep on going about. It comes out on the news and it looks like it might be something big, and then it just disappears. Some other kind of propaganda pops up and distracts mankind from what's taking place there on the 7 hills of Rome. Well, Pastor, he's always taught about what's taking place and what sin is coming forth and how it's confused mankind's mind, and he'll continue to do so. Look in verse 40 here. He shows where this confusion comes from, where the deception, the confusion, the perversion, the defilement, the inability to think clearly, to make rational decisions, to work out differences. Pastor says in verse 40, there's a lot more sodomites in the world than you would ever believe today. They're running the world, and Yahweh shows their minds are confused. And that is what's bringing forth the wars. What we're seeing right here is a matter of iniquity. The increase of iniquity and the love that Yahweh put within the natural man disappearing from the natural man. This sodomatic religion spreading forth to destroy the minds of men. Men and women, but destroy the minds of mankind. And these things spread forth, and consider that, men. Consider that before you would ever think, to disobey and not heed the warnings that Pastor has given us about protecting ourselves from the world, and not being a part of the world, coming out of the world and being separate, making sure we're practicing and protecting ourselves against this defilement. You can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't hear it, but it's all out there, and you can see the results of it. You can see the results of it every day. You turn on the news and just see how mankind's minds are just dwindling down, further and further and further. You think one day, wow, it couldn't get any worse than this. And the next day, things worse, much, much worse. And then Pastor shows here in verse 45 and 46, shows about the nuclear explosion, how these things go up They go up into the sky, into the atmosphere, and these things spread forth, and then they fall down. You know, as it says in Deuteronomy about raining powder and dust upon your land until you be destroyed. Pastor says in verse 47, well, of course, this is coming. I've been leading up to this for months and months and months now concerning this nuclear war and concerning the Babylon. And that's what I want you to go back to right now in Isaiah 13, where we see this burden of Babylon. We covered it last week, but I didn't really want to cover what I want to cover today because it takes a long time to get this over, but you have to understand it. First, in Isaiah chapter 11, if you remember, he shows the work of the last days, and a message that's going to be taken out by the branch, by the olive trees, the branches that pour out their golden oil into the people, letting them have salvation, a place in the kingdom, which is a training period by the last day's witness. You know, and this is what's important in Yahweh's eyes. Nuclear war is coming. It's been prophesied. Yahweh knows it's coming. He's not worried about when it's going to take place or if it's going to take place. He knows that mankind will destroy themselves. Sinners will destroy themselves. What is Yahweh concerned with men? What we see right here, we see about the branches pouring out their golden oil into the people, letting them have salvation, a place in the kingdom, which is a training period by the last day's witness. He's worried about, and not worried, but his focus is on, will we accept our calling? Will we train to become sons of Yahweh? Will we allow ourselves to humble ourselves to a lowly okie, and take on this righteous character of Yahweh's? A training period that Yahweh shows will take place to establish or bring in the rest of the number that he wants to use in his kingdom to receive the great powers that he intends to give to his house. And man, Yahweh continue to bless you and lead and guide you. At this time, I'm all out of time. I have the great privilege and honor to turn it over to one of Yahweh's great priests, the great Kohan, Kenneth Hawkins.
Please be seated. Let's go ahead and rehearse that title again. I mean, this was really a great turnover point here because, you know, what we're getting into, you know, Ka'am Matithya led us in to the way Pastor set this sermon up. And it's just like what he said there in verse 48, a training period that Yahweh shows will take place to establish or bring in the rest of the number. That's what we're waiting for right now, the rest of the number that he wants to use in his kingdom and receive the great powers that he intends to give to his house. Now, once again, this is chapter 25, the title, the two witnesses, famous prophecies that scholars have struggled over for centuries. Who is this man? Speaking, of course, the pastor, number 16. Isaiah 13:1, and this part of the sermon gets into the title here. The burden against Babylon. We're going to see what the burden is. Pastor actually it goes into great detail to explain this. The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah son of Amoz saw, the burden of Babylon, running abreast with the work of Yahweh. The warning is going out at this time. And of course, this sermon was given 12/18/2010, but just like with the Great Kahan covered day, I mean, this is taking place as we see prophecy unfolding. Just think about that sermon, I mean, that verse that he covered there, verse 40. There's a lot more Sodomites, and of course, this is Pastor stating this. There's a lot more Sodomites in the world than you would ever believe today. Okay, now that was in 2010, and he basically prophesied what we see today, where the next line comes in. They're running the world, and Yahweh shows their minds are confused. Now, people can't see that. You know, we need to really be paying attention, you know, to the news that's being brought by the great house of Yahweh. We're going to go ahead and continue there in verse 49 on page 255, you know, in the book of Yisrayl. Pastor says, well, here in Isaiah 13:1 now he says the burden against Babylon. And of course, he's going to further go on to explain that this word burden basically leads to prophecy. So you can look at it there as the prophecy against Babylon, this message being fulfilled in these the last days by this era of the great house of Yahweh, all prophesied, by Yahweh, is putting this burden against Babylon. Okay, now most people get it in their minds. If you know anything about history, geography, or so forth, they get it in their minds a certain city. Speaking of Babylon, that sits in a certain place. That, of course, was destroyed. So that's all they can see. But this is not what this is speaking of here. First off, he's talking about Isaiah 11. Okay, and the same thing Yeshua was talking about taking a message, taking this message as it spoke of by Yeshua in Matthew 24, to all nations, all the world. That prophecy started in Isaiah 2, speaking about the reestablishment of the house of Yahweh. And Pastor says here, in the last days I will establish my house in the chief of the nations. Now, that prophecy to us in the beginning, when we first came to the house of Yahweh, we started learning of the laws and the prophecies. We didn't really understand it. I didn't. It was specifically talking about this last day's work being reestablished and doing just what's taking place right now. And that's fulfilling prophecy, of this nuclear destruction that the great priest covered earlier, that's going to come upon the earth. We have to believe this is going to take place, Now in verse 50 there, Pastor says, but here he says now, Isaiah 13:1, the burden against Babylon. That's verse 1, which Isaiah, son of Amos, saw. This is the same Babylon as we see in Revelation. It's the characteristics of what we see in that religion. And, of course, Isaiah the prophet showed this character that they were bringing forth, which was actually started with Nimrod, the character with the Nimrod schools of higher learning. Now think about Babylon as it's stated, Okay, I hope you remember these sermons. That was started by Cush. It says in verse 2, lift up a banner upon the high mountains, raise your voice. The internet and television are the highest mountains you can come from now. And this is talking about a promotion, the promotion of the house of Yahweh. So get the dirt and the rocks out of your thinking here. That's like the Tower of Babel. This was not a tower, but an ideology, okay, that was going to build strength and so forth to the people, where they could become very strong and keep from being scattered by other people that were forming colonies and armies and so forth. And Pastor's going to go on to show, this was the deception. It's actually what brought forward the deception throughout the earth, was this way of Nimrod, through the schools of higher learning. And now he's in verse 2 of Isaiah 13. Lift up a banner upon the high mountains, raise your voice. Now this is all speaking, prophesying of the witness, Yisrayl, and the house of Yahweh in the last days. Raise your voice to them, wave your hand, so they may enter the gates of the called out ones. Well, of course, that's exactly what we're doing. It's what we've been doing from day one in the house of Yahweh. Now, Isaiah 11, if you think about it, which was a couple of chapters before 13, Isaiah 11 speaks of the branch, and then, of course, we know in Zechariah speaking about this work of the branch with Yeshua, the great high priest. Now, Pastor says, look at verse 6 here and verse 53 of the book of Yisrayl. Look at verse 6. He says, wail for the day of Yahweh is at hand. Now the day of Yahweh, and he puts a question mark there, okay? If you know anything about my writings or the previous sermons, you'll know the day of Yahweh is that day right now, brethren. It's all talking about this time period in the seventh era of the great work of Yahweh, of the house of Yahweh. And that day right now when he is dealing with the nations. And how does he deal with the nations? With the prophecies, bringing forth the message of Yahweh, the laws and the prophecies. He's judging among the nations, and then at the end of that, it ends with nuclear war. Just like what Matithia brought forth. This is the end. The end is nuclear war. Okay, but the great day of Yahweh, see in this same chapter here, is shown with the burden against Babylon or the prophecy against Babylon. They just interchange that word, burden, with prophecy. Babylon or confusion against this prophecy or this burden is against the confusion it's brought. But the great day of Yahweh here is mentioned. He says the last days, the great day of Yahweh, or last days as it's called. And you can go through this entire sermon and those words right there, the great day of Yahweh, the last days, this generation. Matithia covered it, and of course we're going to see it a little bit later here. Pastor covered that quite a bit, showing that this prophecy is being fulfilled and it speaks of this time period. Okay? Now let's drop down. I wrote a note here, Isaiah 58, cry aloud, lift up your voice like a trumpet. Speaking of Pastor's last day work, Yahweh's last day spokesman. Okay, now in verse 55, Pastor says, now Isaiah is also showing us the great day of Yahweh and Babylon that was also shown by Yisrayl. If you turn over to Yisrayl 2, and let's start here with, verse 26. Yisrayl 2:26, and he says, and you will eat. This is what we're doing now. We're eating this spiritual food that's been given unto us through the spokesman. No other person on earth can actually bring forth this spiritual food of the prophecies of the house of Yahweh. Okay? But he says, and you will eat. Now, speaking of the house of Yahweh, he always carries this forth. He, like Isaiah did, he carries forth the work of Yahweh. And then he shows, on the other hand, the world. Now let's go ahead. He speaks about the time of Caesar there, and the way, and we're going to cover this too, in the way of what was taking place at this time, where the world leaders were warning the people to be ready for this nuclear war. Okay, so let's skip over to, let's see here. Let's go to verse 60 there in the second column. And Pastor says, so if we have a war here, we want to hit Iran, or they know that the United States and Israel want to get rid of Iran, and start looking at this and putting it in what's taking place today. The president is meeting with the president of Israel, and of course that's supposed to be a gateway to him meeting with Netanyahu, because President Biden and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, have never got along. So just think about that, because Israel wants to hit Iran, and Pastor has covered that quite a bit. Okay? Now he continues on here, and he says, the world is out that they want to devastate the armies of Iran and be able to go in and take the cities without too much fighting. So these are their plans to destroy. Now, the way the armies are set up in Iran, it would take nuclear bombs to do this. And just like the great Matithia brought out earlier, this is all in and around the great river of Euphrates. remember, a third part of the people are going to be destroyed over that fourth part of the earth. That's a prophecy for your generation. This is, again, he's speaking of this generation, this time period, the last days, the day of Yahweh. This is all in this time period here. Okay, when the House of Yahweh's message is also going out to warn the world. And like Pastor said, and this did not take place in the beginning of this work. It's only through the development of the communications that Pastor was allowed to do through technology. Think about Daniel's prophecies, where now this message is going out throughout the entire world. That has never been done before, not in any part of any plan of Yahweh as the entire world been educated in the way that we are today, educating them in the laws and prophecies. Okay, the House of Yahweh's message is also going out to warn the world, to warn all nations of this. Okay, now he goes into the skirmishes between North Korea and South Korea, and he talks about what Malachi Martin had brought out about Russia and China. And let's see here. And verse 64, he's saying, I'm saying the time is right. Right now, when the United States is spread out thin with its armies. Now think about that. This was in 2010, and think about what's taking place today. You know, even more thinner, you know, is the armies of the United States with its allies, so-called allies. They're spread out throughout the entire earth. Okay, it's not like they can do a big hit, you know, but like Pastor says, the powers of the world look at this. Now is the time to hit. I think the United States knows this. I think their Pentagon would be fools if they hadn't considered it already. But I think they know this, and they're getting prepared for the worst now. It's gone too far. And just think about even how much further it's gone here 13 years later. Now he talks about, well, here are the politicians, and they're saying, we've got to get word out to the people how to protect themselves. You know, their warning is fear. Okay, our warning is one to know and understand that this is going to take place. You know, if you don't get out of the cities, like Pastor had mentioned earlier, you know, all through his warnings here, the cities are the ones that's going to suffer the worst of it. Now let's go to verse 66. And Pastor says, well, this is a time period called the Great Day of Yahweh. So this Great Day of Yahweh is not one day, it's a time period, which we saw back in Isaiah now, that concerns the burden of Babylon, or the prophecy against Babylon that is shown here, showing us it's not Babylon the city, but Babylon the institution, which was brought forth by Cush through the teachings, through this Nimrod system, the educational institution. In fact, you know, if you think about it, all of the armies actually start with these schools of higher learning. You know, doesn't matter, Navy, Army, or whatever, Air Force, it all starts in these higher education schools. Okay, now in Yahweh 2:26, and you will eat in plenty, he says, be satisfied and praise the name of Yahweh your Father, who has dealt wondrously with you. He's talking about us, the house of Yahweh. And my people will never be ashamed. In verse 27 of Yahweh 2, and you will know that I am in the midst of you. That's how we know that we have the protection of Yahweh. Those who lift up holy hands or sacred hands to Yahweh or rule as Yahweh rules. That I am Yahweh your Father, and that there is no other. Then my people will never be ashamed. Never. Okay? In verse 28, And it will come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Okay, that is left of the nations. And you can see the way he puts this together, that this is just a continued prophecy. And your sons and your daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams. He's telling you about a future. This right here should have been written in much more extension right here. It should have been explained, and you can do it with the Hebrew words by just more explanation in that verse. But these are talking about the offices that Yahweh talked about in Revelation 20. It's talking about the offices that's going to be given to you and I and many other people who's going to come out of great tribulation. Even offices, working offices, they're going to take place here, and your old men will be involved in the work. The young people will be involved in the work also. So for time's sake, let's kind of move on a little bit here. He talks in verse 29, and also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit, which is the laws and the prophecies. Okay? Now in verse 73 here, Pastor says in Yahweh 2:31, the sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and wonderful day of Yahweh comes, or as this culmination takes place with nuclear war. Okay, remember now Isaiah 13 and the burden of Babylon. It's speaking of the great day of Yahweh, the great day of Yahweh, the same time period. Again, this generation, okay? Great and wonderful day of Yahweh comes. Now, let's go ahead and drop down to verse 76 there. Pastor says, Yahweh in promoting his house, we just went through that time period, his explanation of that period in prophecy. He lifted me up for all the world to see with a $10 million bond on my head. Of course, talking about when Pastor was arrested. Okay, that's the way he did it. Now he's lifting me up, and somebody told me they had a letter on the internet saying, why wasn't this man named put down for Man of the Year? Because that's the way in which Yahweh brought forth the house of Yahweh, by allowing this persecution to come upon the house through the arrest of Yahweh's servant Yisrayl. Okay, let's drop down to verse 78. He says in verse 32, and of course this is in Yael 2, he says, and whoever will call with the name of Yahweh will be delivered. Now that's only out of the house of Yahweh, okay? To the place where the 613 laws are taught, the way of peace, which is the word translated Jerusalem. There will be deliverance, as Yahweh has said, among the remnant which is left of this time period, okay? And also the remnant who Romans shows, the book of Romans shows we are. Let's see here. Let's go to verse 81. Pastor says, in other words, what they're saying is they're going to build a tower to deceive the people. Now, this takes place through this Nimrod system. Now, this is talking about deception, but make them think that the heavens are on their side. And Pastor covered this with the building of these tall buildings, as Babylon was portrayed. And on their side, or that Creator is on their side, and this is the psychology of this great tower, They built a building in New York, a high one. They built another high one. Then they built the Empire State Building and so forth. It's an impression. It's an impression upon the people. It's an idea of an impression that we are great, we're the greatest, and that's what was coming forth from their schools of science and the higher learning schools. Now let's see here. Now let's go down in Genesis, Pastor talks about in Genesis 11:4, and Pastor talks about in 83 here, he says this phrase, it says it's not more hyperbole, but an expression of pride and rebellion. Again, speaking of Babylon, or the word Babylon. Okay, now this is what the Hebrew authorities say on this word. This phrase is not more hyperbole, but an expression of pride and rebellion manifested by the Babel burdens. You know, pride and rebellion, that's what in fact the word Nimrod means. When Cush fathered this school of higher learning, that's what it was called. He who rebels. Okay? Let's see here. Let's go down to verse 88 there. Pastor says, but notice he says, Yahweh, this was a message at Jeremiah. You need to read all that chapter there. And he was in Jeremiah 43, okay? Maybe you could read that today, you know, as the Sabbath comes in. But it's talking about Jeremiah warning them. Well, they said, we don't want your warnings. The same thing we hear today from the world. You know, they're trying to scare the people to keep them from going with us and building a great tower in Egypt and taking over that land. So we want you to shut your mouth and leave us alone. And of course, that's what they told Jeremiah. And of course, Jeremiah's work was a very, very persecuted work. Okay, and the others said, we're going to kill you if you keep on prophesying in the name Yahweh. They wanted to shut that completely down, is what they did with this work here. Now in verse 89, he says, but remember everything that's said, because it ties in with the full plan of Yahweh. And carrying this thing out like he did, because Egypt is not run by anyone except Hebrews today. Now, I always think, about Genesis 49 and the fact that, Yahweh only deals with the 12 tribes. That is the Israelites. In verse 13, he will demolish the sacred pillars, but he's speaking of the end again here, this time period, the end. We are bringing down this work of Babylon, this work of the Catholic Church. But he's speaking of the end again here. Even though some of it took place in wars, he's actually speaking again here of the end of the days, which is our work, our time period, end of time. Okay, now let's go down to verse 94 here. Pastor says, well, it's still coming down. This confusion is still coming down to us today when they're trying to make you think you're worshiping the true Savior, Yeshua, and following the disciples because they couldn't turn people from this. The world is totally deceived when they read the King James Version. It's only the House of Yahweh that chose the deception. Okay, there were too many million people who were following Yeshua and his disciples, so they tried to bring these deceptions in, and they did it in a rather unique way. You could tell that the psychologists here were the best in the world. Well, they still are. That's all they study, and they brought forth, and they all have this experience. And as Pastor closes up here in verse 97, we'll look at verse 96 there, and Pastor shows that's a Hebrew name, by the way. This name that he was spoken about in the city of this city in Egypt. Well, that burning now, that great burning that is speaking of here is not, he's going to take a match and set it on fire. It's a nuclear burning. That's what Pastor has always preached. It will be a nuclear burning that the world sees now that we're going into. and they are trying it and trying to keep it from leaking out. But we are going into that time period. Let me get this marked right here so that I, won't. And he's talking about he's actually marking his place for this next chapter here that we'll cover next law class. But in verse 97, where he wraps it up here, he says, the things that the world is trying to catch up on now is a place of safety for the people. But they're not going to be, I'm afraid, enough basements, to protect the people. Once this word gets out, they're going to be causing more trouble than they did even for Caesar, because the fear is going to start spreading here very, very soon. As the nations develop into their activity, the prophesied activity that is taking place in and around the great river Euphrates. And of course, Pastor closes up there, and he's going to continue it here in this, in the conclusion. There's like 2 more chapters that's left in this book. And then, of course, we'll go, I think, to the 11th book of Yisrayl. So if everyone would please stand, we'll go ahead and close there. And let's go ahead and lift our hands in prayer. Heavenly Father Yahweh, this is Kohan Kanath Hawkins, together with your men, Father Yahweh, as we conclude this law class, all being a seed of your anointed servant Yisrayl, and unity with the body of priests in the great house of Yahweh, and by and through the authority of our great and honorable high priest and judge and soon coming King, Yeshua Messiah, asking and praying, Father Yahweh, for your dismissal in this law class, and that you would, Father Yahweh, instill within us a mind to confess and repent and turn away from sin as we get ready to go to confessions. And we just ask and pray that you would continually be with us, as we look forward to the incoming Sabbath day, and in this 5th moon of Abraham. We just, again, we bless you, thank you, and ask and pray that you would allow us to go in peace, all by and through the authority of Yeshua Messiah. We pray as the seedy anointed servant Yisrael, being guided by Spirit sacred. Hallelujah, Yahweh. Praise Yahweh.